Should there be a public domestic violence registry? This presentation, prepared by Yana Minkova and Mihaela Dimitrova, looks at the advantages and disadvantages of having a public domestic violence registry. Recorded domestic abuse offences in London have significantly risen in recent years. Since 2011-12, domestic abuse-related incidents recorded by the Metropolitan Police Service have increased by 70%, representing 32,000 additional cases. 6.9% of women and 3.7% of men, aged 16-74, were victims of domestic abuse between March 2017 and March 2018. 84,000 domestic abuse cases were reported between December 2017 and November 2018 in London alone, and 1 in 3 victims have been attacked more than once. Between January and November 2018, there were 29 domestic homicides in the capital compared to 9 victims in the whole of 2017. And 25% of lesbian, gay and bisexual people and up to 80% of transgender people have been the victims of domestic abuse. Considering the statistics, there is an obvious need to introduce a registry, regardless of how seemingly insignificant an improvement might be, as domestic violence is becoming an epidemic and one of the top 10 crimes committed in the capital. Liz Roberts MP proposed that convicted domestic violence offenders should provide their name, date of birth, home address and national insurance number. They would also be required to inform the police of any new relationship, and failing to do so could result in imprisonment. Recidivists and those sentenced to 30 months or more for domestic violence or coercive control would remain on the register indefinitely. Later, the House of Commons published a domestic abuse report recommending that the National Register of Serial Stalkers and Domestic Violence Perpetrators is introduced as a matter of urgency. At the moment, there is no functioning registry for domestic violence offenders. However, we strongly advocate the creation of one, as the current system has mainly focused on the victim and has had little effect. It is time to shift the focus from the victim to the perpetrator. The creation of a domestic violence registry can be done in 2 ways: publicly accessible, just like the Sex Offenders Registry in the USA, or similarly to the Sex Offenders Registry in the UK, which is only available to law enforcement authorities. So, should we follow the said precedent and make the domestic violence registry available to the police only? Although many would consider it more appropriate to follow the established practices, we believe that the domestic violence register should be publicly available. We acknowledge that a publicly available registry has some disadvantages, but most are related to the consequences that the offenders have to suffer from being on the list. And we shouldn't forget that it was their free choice to commit the crime, and maybe they should own up to their actions. Overall, the disadvantages do not outweigh the advantages, and considering that domestic violence is becoming an epidemic, even the slightest possibility of achieving better results in decreasing crime rates calls for a greater support, and we believe that a publicly available registry will be more effective to reduce crime rates by shifting the focus on the perpetrators. We will now list the benefits of a publicly available domestic violence registry. And to do that, we'll use the facts of the case R.V. Marvin to demonstrate how victims can benefit from a publicly accessible register. On the 21st July 2017, Marvin, 39, was found guilty of subjecting his girlfriend's 5-year-old son, Alex Malcolm, to a brutal attack in Mansfield Park, Catford. Alex suffered fatal head and stomach injuries and died 2 days after the incidents. The defender attacked Alex's mother as she tried to get medical help for her unconscious son. He has a string of previous convictions for violent offenses, including attacks on former partners and armed robbery, of which Alex's mom was not aware. The government has developed the law to allow for tougher actions against abusers. However, reoffending rates remain too high. Introducing a publicly accessible domestic violence register will provide life-saving information to new partners who will have the opportunity to end the relationship before the abuse even begins. Or in our case, Alex's mom would find out about her partner's violent past and could end the relationship before the fatality happened. Also, there is a strong social stigma involved in going on a list, which can deter some perpetrators from committing domestic-related crimes. This effect was clearly demonstrated with the Sex Offenders Registry since it was introduced in 1997. Even though it's available to law enforcement only, it helps the authorities to manage offenders but also deters potential offenders as they're concerned how being on the register could affect their life. They might be judged by the community and potentially face barriers to employment and future relationships. The offender in our case was able to continue to reoffend without fear of exposure and thus any major consequences. A public register would endanger his social standing, future career and relationships, therefore acting as a deterrent. For the reasons mentioned above, introducing a public domestic violence registry would be cost-effective in the long run, thus allowing for resources to be invested in raising awareness, first response, and providing further training to police officers. Referring back to our case, had the mother known the violent history of the defendant, Alex would still be alive, and the justice system would have been spared the expense of arresting and prosecuting the defendant, and furthermore, spared the expense of housing the prisoner. We will now move on to discussing any possible problems with having a publicly accessible register. Offenders would struggle to form a new relationship due to the nature of their past crime. Convicts are likely to have a low social status and be shunned from their community. Lacking job opportunities may also push them towards crime to support themselves. They could also be subject to harassment and public shaming, which can lead to physical and mental health issues. People who are wrongfully convicted would also have to live with the consequences of being on the register.
Zach went on a racy dating app called Hot or Not, hoping to meet a girl. He did. They had sex, and that's when the problems began.
How old did she say she was?
She had told me that she was 17.
But she lied. She was actually 14. By law, he had committed a sex crime. He was arrested and convicted. Now Zach is on the same list of sex offenders as child molesters and pedophiles, and his parents say that's a colossal mistake.
From a procedural justice perspective, a public domestic violence register and indeed any domestic violence disclosure scheme requires a careful balancing between the right to know and the right to privacy. This brings into conflict the rights to protection afforded to victims, including in severe domestic violence cases, the Article 2 right to life and Article 3 right to freedom from inhuman or degrading treatment, and the right afforded to a perpetrator or a suspect, including the right to control personal information and the right to form a relationship, as well as the right to respect for private and family life. Article 8, right to privacy, is a fundamental but not an absolute right. Therefore, in this case, interference with Article 8 is justified for the purpose of preventing crime. Currently, civilians requesting information can rely on the Domestic Abuse Disclosure Scheme, also known as Clare's Law. Claire Woods was brutally murdered by her ex-partner, George Appleton, in her own home simply because she decided to end their relationship. Appleton subjected her to an appalling ordeal, raping and strangling her in her bed and then setting fire to her body. Claire was unaware of his criminal record of abusive offenses. Claire's father said, "Had I known about his criminal record, I would have marched Claire back to the family home myself." So, the Domestic Abuse Disclosure Scheme aims to protect potential victims of domestic violence by providing information whether their partner has been previously convicted of abusive offenses. The scheme aims to enable potential victims to make an informed decision whether they want to continue the relationship and provides help and support to assist the potential victim when making that decision. Theresa May said Clare's Law is just a rough measure introduced to hand control back to the victim by ensuring they can make an informed decision about the relationship and escape if necessary. However, she also said that protection for victims is improving, but sadly there are still too many cases where vulnerable people are let down, and we have identified two main problems with the disclosure scheme. First, the disclosure scheme requires a number of steps to be followed for information to be given out, which slows down the process, decreasing the effectiveness of the scheme. This problem will be avoided with a public register. Disclosures are also not always made, which can deprive an individual from a life-saving information. The use of the scheme is patchy and inconsistent, and once again, this problem can be avoided simply by introducing a publicly available register. Overall, our research led us to conclude that the publicly available register would be beneficial to society and the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. It became evident that the current measures are insufficient in dealing with the issue, considering the worrying statistics mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. There is an urgent need to create a register, and we believe that a public register would have a better effect on decreasing the domestic violence rates than a register available to the police only, providing immediate information to potential victims, deterring offenders, and being cost-effective are just a small fraction of the benefits that will come from a publicly available registry. Do you want to hire a person with a domestic violence related conviction to work in your office and be alone with him? Do you really want to buy a house next to a violent offender? Do you want to let your child have a sleepover at a friend's house whose dad has a violent past?